I'm standing on the bank of Wallen's Creek, here in the rugged heart of Virginia. Today, the only sounds are the water moving over stones and the whisper of wind through the sycamores. It's a peaceful place, the kind of place you might come to forget the world for a while. But this ground doesn't forget. If you stand here long enough, the peace begins to feel thin, like a blanket laid over something terrible. This is a place of echoes. This quiet creek is where the legend of Daniel Boone ends and the story of the man begins. Not the folk hero in the coonskin cap, but a father whose life was shattered right here on this spot. The story we think we know is a comfortable lie. The truth is soaked into this soil, a tale of such brutality it would redirect the course of a man's life and a nation's history. Today, we're going to listen to those echoes and uncover the story of the dark and bloody ground. In the autumn of 1773, this same wilderness was not a place of quiet solitude. It was filled with the sounds of a dream in motion, the groan of wagon wheels, the lowing of cattle, the shouts of men, and the laughter of children. This was Daniel Boone's grand gamble, the first organized attempt to bring settler families into the promised land of Kentucky. They were a small, rolling nation of about 40 souls, carving a path through a world that had, until now, belonged only to the Long Hunters and the native tribes. Daniel Boone wasn't the giant of folklore yet. He was a 38-year-old father and husband, his face already lined by the sun and hardship, but his eyes were fixed on a future he could almost taste. He saw Kentucky not as a contested battleground, but as an untouched Eden, a place where a man could build a life from the ground up, beholden to no one. He was a guide, a protector, a patriarch leading his flock into a new world. At his side was his eldest son, James. At 16, he was on the cusp of manhood, strong and capable, already possessing a quiet confidence learned from his father in the deep woods. He was Daniel's shadow and his legacy, the boy who would help him tame this new land. For James, this journey wasn't just about following his father. It was the great adventure of his young life, a chance to prove himself and to be part of the founding of a new society. The air in those early days of October must have felt electric with possibility. Every mile they pushed westward through the Cumberland Gap, the world grew wilder, more beautiful, and more their own. They were leaving behind the crowded lands and the rigid rules of the colonies. Out here, the only law was the law of survival, and the only king was the vast, empty sky. They were tough, self-reliant people, but they were not warriors looking for a fight. They were farmers, husbands and wives, carrying their most precious possessions, iron pots, family Bibles, and the seeds for next year's crop. They believed in the promise of the land, a promise whispered to them by men like Boone. They had no idea they were seen not as pioneers, but as an invasion, and that the land itself and its ancient guardians were preparing to demand a terrible price for their trespass. The whispers from this creek are powerful, but to give them a voice, you have to turn to the written record. The story isn't just in the soil, it's locked away in archives, in letters written by hands that trembled with grief and shock. I'm holding a copy of one such document. It's a letter from Captain William Russell to Colonel William Preston, dated October 12, 1773. The paper is a copy, but the original is as brittle as a dry leaf, the ink faded to the color of rust. This isn't just an old piece of correspondence, it is a dispatch from the edge of a nightmare. William Russell was another leader of the expedition, and his own son Henry was with James Boone that night. This is a letter from one father to the world, trying to make sense of the unthinkable. He writes of the search party and of the discovery. He describes the scene with the stark, horrified clarity of a man who can't unsee what he's witnessed. He calls the perpetrators inhuman and details how the boys were tortured in the most barbarous manner. This document is the key. It's the first official confirmation of the event, transforming local horror into historical fact. It verifies the location, the date, and the sheer savagery of the attack. It is a cold, hard piece of the past that proves the echoes here are real. But this letter, for all its terrible detail, raises a more profound question. It tells us what happened, but it doesn't tell us why. This wasn't just a raid for supplies or a swift, violent skirmish. The level of brutality described here was intentional. It was a message, written in blood. To understand that message, we have to look beyond the settlers' hopes and see this land through the eyes of the people who already called it home. To understand the horror described in that letter, you have to understand the land itself. To the Shawnee, the Cherokee, and the Delaware, Kentucky wasn't an empty paradise waiting for a master. It was Ken-tah-ten, the land of tomorrow, a sacred and vital hunting preserve. They didn't build their villages there, but it was their great commons, a shared cathedral of forest and meadow teeming with the buffalo, elk, and deer that sustained their people. Its borders were jealously guarded, and they called it the dark and bloody ground for a reason. When Daniel Boone's party of settlers snaked its way through the mountains, they were not seen as brave pioneers. They were seen as a plague. The Long Hunters had been one thing, solitary men who took some game and left. But this was different. This was a tide of axes and fences, of families and cabins. This was an army of permanence, an existential threat to a way of life that had existed for centuries. Every tree they felled, every patch of cane they cleared, was an act of war. Watching this slow-moving invasion was a war party, a coalition of Shawnee, Delaware, and Cherokee warriors. They were not a random band of marauders. They were the guardians of this land, men whose families depended on the game Boone's settlers were about to displace. They would have tracked the party for days, observing them with a mix of fury and contempt. The settlers' noisy, lumbering progress was an insult to the silence of the woods, a clear sign they did not belong. The decision to attack was a calculated one, and the decision to make it a spectacle of cruelty was a strategic one. They needed to send a message so terrifying that it would echo all the way back to the colonies in Virginia and Pennsylvania. They needed to turn the dream of Kentucky into a nightmare. When James Boone's small group separated from the main party, it offered the perfect opportunity. They weren't just going to kill the intruders. They were going to make their deaths a lesson. The barbarism Captain Russell would later describe in his letter wasn't mindless savagery. It was a deliberate act of psychological warfare designed to break the will of the invaders and burn the memory of this failure into Daniel Boone's soul forever. To understand a story this old, the paper trail can only take you so far. You have to find the people who have kept the story alive, not in books, but in memory. In a small town nestled in the Cumberland Gap, I found a local historian named Silas Blackwood. He's not an academic. He's a man whose family has lived in the shadow of these mountains since before Kentucky was a state. His knowledge comes from stories told on front porches, passed down from one generation to the next like a well-worn rifle. He looked over my copy of the Russell letter, his brow furrowed. "This is the white man's truth," he said, his voice raspy like dry leaves. "It tells you a storm came through and tore the roof off the barn. It doesn't tell you why the lightning chose to strike right there, right then." He explained that for 200 years, another version of the story has been whispered in these hills, a version that provides a motive far more terrifying than a simple land dispute. According to the tale passed down in his family, the war party wasn't just a random collection of warriors. It was led by a Shawnee warrior who was already carrying a deep and personal wound. The previous spring, his own son, a boy not much older than James Boone, had been killed during a skirmish with a party of white Long Hunters. For this man, the sight of Boone's settlers, an unstoppable wave of the very people who had taken his child, was not just a political threat. It was a personal desecration. This detail, passed down outside the official record, changes everything. The unspeakable acts committed on the bank of Wallen's Creek were not just a strategic message of terror. They were a targeted, ritualistic act of revenge, a horrific mirror image of the warrior's own grief. It was meant to be a dark sacrament of an eye for an eye. It was designed specifically to make Daniel Boone, the great leader, feel the exact same hollowing loss that had destroyed his own life. The lightning wasn't random, it was aimed directly at a father's heart. On the night of October 9th, 1773, the air in the mountains grew cold. For the main body of settlers, it was a normal evening. Fires lit, guards posted, the familiar sounds of a camp settling in for the night. But miles away, a smaller group, including James Boone and Henry Russell, had separated from the others to chase down a stray horse and gather supplies. It was a routine task, the kind of thing these frontier boys had done 100 times before. They were capable, unafraid, and utterly oblivious that they were being watched. The war party had shadowed them for days, moving like ghosts through the forest. At its head, if the old stories are true, was a man whose heart was already a cold, dead stone. He was not just a warrior defending his land, he was a grieving father. And as he watched James Boone, the strong, promising son of the man leading this invasion, he saw not an enemy to be killed, but a debt to be collected. This was the moment he had been waiting for, a chance to make the world balance again in the only way he had left, through pain. The boys made camp by Wallen's Creek, building a small fire against the chill. They were young men full of talk about the future, about the land they would clear and the homes they would build. They were confident in their skills, secure in their small bubble of firelight, believing the deep, dark woods around them were empty. You can almost hear their last conversation, the easy banter of youth on the edge of a great adventure. They fell asleep under a canopy of ancient trees, dreaming of a Kentucky that would never exist for them. The attack was not a battle, it was an execution. It came in that disorienting pre-dawn gray, a sudden explosion of violence that ripped the sleeping camp apart. There was no time to fight back, only to be overwhelmed by a wave of silent, purposeful fury. Several in the small party were cut down in their bedrolls, their lives extinguished before they were even fully awake. But James Boone and Henry Russell were not killed. They were seized, dragged from their blankets, their arms bound tight. This was the moment that sealed their fate. The skirmish was over. The warriors had won. They could have vanished back into the woods, leaving the bodies as a stark warning. But the leader's eyes fixed on the captured boys. In that instant, the strategic goal of terrorizing the settlers merged with the raw personal need for vengeance. The son of the leader for the son of the leader. A life for a life, a wound for a wound. The decision was made. The remaining captives were quickly and brutally dispatched, but James and Henry were kept alive. They were shoved toward the creek bank, their pleas and struggles met with stony silence. The point of no return had been crossed. This was no longer about land or resources. It had become a dark ritual, a sacrifice to be performed on the altar of grief. And the dawn that was about to break would bring not light, but a descent into an unimaginable hell. Up on the highway, there's a historical marker, a simple metal sign that gives you the cold, hard facts, the names, the date, the event. It's an official scar, an attempt to nail down this ghost to a specific point on a map. But the sign is for passing cars and tourists. It sanitizes the story. The real marker, the real testament to what happened, isn't up there on the roadside. It's down here by the water. I'm standing on the creek bank now. It's a small, flat clearing, barely big enough for a few men and a campfire. The river stones are smooth and gray, worn down by countless years of flowing water. It's a perfect place to camp, naturally sheltered, which is exactly why the boys would have chosen it. This little patch of ground is the only physical evidence that's left. This is the stage. There are no monuments here, no weathered cross, no pile of stones to mark the spot. Nature has reclaimed it all. But standing here, you feel it. This isn't just a place, it's a crime scene. The silence is different. It's heavier. You can almost feel the weight of what this soil has absorbed. Right here. This is where it happened. And each of these smooth, silent stones is a silent testament to the chaos of that morning, a witness to an act so cruel that it would stain this ground forever. The fire on the creek bank was no longer a source of warmth or comfort. It had become a spotlight on a stage of unimaginable cruelty. James Boone and Henry Russell were bound, the last glimmers of hope extinguished from their eyes. Their captors moved not with the frantic energy of a raid, but with a chilling deliberateness, a sense of grim ceremony. This was not going to be a quick end. This was going to be a lesson. The work began. The first sound was not a scream, but a sharp, choked cry that was swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. The violence that followed was methodical. It was not the hot-blooded rage of a battle, but the cold, patient work of men intent on deconstruction. The sounds that carried across the water were not those of a fight, but of something being systematically taken apart. The fire threw their silhouettes against the ancient sycamores, long, distorted shadows that flinched and writhed in a terrible dance. The sharp, clean scent of pine from the fire was soon corrupted by something else, a smell of scorching that was deeply, fundamentally wrong, an odor of violation that clung to the damp night air. It was the smell of something sacred being made profane. The boys' voices, which had pleaded and begged, had broken. Now, the only sounds were guttural, involuntary responses to a pain beyond the limits of language. It was the sound of humanity being stripped away, layer by layer, until only the raw nerve of existence remained. The warriors worked in near silence, their movements economical and precise, as if following the steps of a dark and ancient ritual. Then, a new sound. The heavy, rhythmic impact of wood against bone and flesh. It was a dull, percussive beat in the heart of the night, sickeningly methodical. A sound of absolute finality, repeated until it was no longer necessary. And then, the abrupt and total silence that followed was more horrifying than any of the sounds that had preceded it. The shadows detached from the trees and melted back into the forest as silently as they had come. They left behind a scene of profound devastation. All that remained was the whispering creek, the dying fire casting a weak orange glow, and two shapes on the ground that no longer resembled boys. A single leather moccasin lay on its side, yards from the fire, a small, lonely testament to a final, futile struggle. This was a story told with knives and arrows. Every wound was a word, every desecration a sentence, arranged to form a single, terrifying message. It was a message intended for one reader, Daniel Boone. When he and the search party finally arrived, they would not find the bodies of enemies slain in battle. They would find a carefully crafted monument to hatred, a masterpiece of revenge designed to do more than kill a son. It was designed to kill a father's soul. After the raw horror of a place like Wallens Creek, you come inside. You go to the quiet, climate-controlled rooms of a historical society where the past is filed away in acid-free folders. You look for the official story. Here, the chaos of that October morning is flattened, pressed between pages, and tamed by the formal language of the 18th century. You find depositions, journal entries, and the same letter from William Russell, now treated as a piece of evidence. The language is always the same. It's stark, formal, and designed to strip away the emotion. A report might state that James Boone, deceased, was discovered by the search party. It lists the names of the dead as if taking inventory. It describes the state of the bodies with a detached, clinical precision that is almost as chilling as the act itself. The report simply lists the cause of death as injuries sustained during an attack by hostile natives. Injuries sustained. It's a phrase meant to create distance. It doesn't mention the fire or the deliberate, methodical nature of the violence. It doesn't capture the image of Daniel Boone kneeling in the dirt next to what was left of his firstborn son, a man whose heart was just ripped out of his chest. The official record has no language for that kind of grief. This is the fundamental conflict of telling these stories. The documents give us the bones, the names, the dates, the locations. But they are silent on the most important truths. They don't record the sound of a father's cry echoing through the woods. They don't capture the cold, calculating fury of a warrior seeking his own dark justice. They record an incident, but they miss the humanity. And for the men on that expedition, the official record wasn't nearly enough. The law of the settlements was slow and distant. The law of the frontier was about to be enforced. There was no manhunt, not in the way we think of one, with a determined posse riding out in a cloud of dust, crying for vengeance. The reality was far more grim. After Daniel Boone and his men buried what was left of their sons in the cold, hard wilderness, the spirit of the expedition was broken. The message of terror sent from the banks of Wallens Creek had been received, loud and clear. They turned back. The dream of Kentucky was drowned in blood, and the retreat back through the Cumberland Gap was a silent, shuffling funeral procession. But the story traveled faster than they did. It moved from one isolated cabin to the next, a spark in dry tinder. The cold, official language of Captain Russell's letter was transformed on the lips of the frontiersmen. Injuries sustained became torn to pieces. Hostile natives became devils from hell. The names of James Boone and Henry Russell became a rallying cry, a justification for a hatred that had long been simmering. The law's pursuit didn't come from a sheriff's office. It came from the governor's mansion in Virginia. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor, saw the massacre not just as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. The dry reports from the frontier were all the pretext he needed to unleash the full force of the colonial militia. There was no courtroom, no judge, no jury. The courtroom was the War Council, and the verdict had been decided long before the trial. The hunt wasn't for a handful of warriors. It was for the entire Shawnee and Mingo nations. The following year, in 1774, Lord Dunmore's War erupted, a brutal campaign to break the power of the tribes in the Ohio Valley and force them to cede their rights to Kentucky. Thousands of militiamen were mobilized, their resolve hardened by stories like the one from Wallens Creek. The pursuit was a scorched earth campaign. The verdict was delivered at the Battle of Point Pleasant, a bloody, day-long engagement that shattered the tribe's resistance. The law of the frontier had rendered its judgment not with a gavel, but with the butt of a long rifle. The price for James Boone's life was a war that would change the map of America forever. You might think a story this important, a sacrifice this foundational, would have a marker, a stone cross, a simple plaque by the creek. But you can search the woods around Wallens Creek all day, and you will find nothing. James Boone has no grave. He was buried where he fell, wrapped in a blanket, and returned to the cold, unforgiving earth of the wilderness he had come to claim. His only tombstone is this creek bank, and his only memorial is the story itself, a ghost that still haunts this patch of ground. The wilderness that promised him a future ended up swallowing him whole. His father, however, is not so hard to find. Travel 200 miles north to the Frankfort Cemetery, in the very heart of the Kentucky Daniel Boone opened to the world. There, on a high bluff overlooking the Kentucky River, is a grand, imposing monument. Carved stone panels depict scenes from his life, and a towering obelisk reaches for the sky. This is where they brought him back, decades after he died in Missouri, a man who had lost all his Kentucky land claims to lawyers and speculators. In death, the state he founded reclaimed him as its primary symbol. The irony is as deep as a mountain valley. The father rests in a place of honor, a tourist attraction where his legend is preserved in stone for all to see. The son, whose horrific death was the bloody price of that legend, has no resting place at all. One is celebrated, the other is anonymous, his bones long since surrendered to the roots of the sycamores. And what of the warriors who took his life? Their graves are scattered across a continent, the unmarked resting places of a people displaced by the very tide Daniel Boone unleashed. This vast distance between the father's monument and the son's lost grave tells its own story. It is the story of what came after the grief, the long, hard years of a man who had to carry the memory of that creek bank with him every day of his life. It raises the final, haunting question: what happens to a man who survives the unsurvivable? For Daniel Boone, the retreat from Wallens Creek was not an end. It was a vow. The grief from that day settled into him, not like a soft sadness, but like a hard piece of iron in his soul. It became the fuel that would drive him for the rest of his life. He had to go back. He had to finish what he started, as if conquering the land that took his son was the only way to quiet the boy's ghost. 2 years later, in 1775, he was back, blazing the wilderness road and raising the walls of a fort called Boonesborough on the banks of the Kentucky River. But the world he built was not the Eden he had dreamed of. It was a fortress. The hope of 1773 was replaced by the grim reality of survival in a war zone. Life was lived with one ear, always listening for a sound that didn't belong, the snap of a twig, the call of a bird that wasn't quite right. The long shadow of that massacre by the creek fell over everything. Every time a child strayed too far from the fort walls, the memory of what happened to James would have returned to Daniel like a fever. The Shawnee had been forced to cede Kentucky by treaty after Lord Dunmore's war, but a piece of paper meant nothing when their way of life was at stake. The fighting didn't stop. It just became more desperate, more personal. The shadow touched Boone's family again in 1776, when his own daughter Jemima was captured by warriors and dragged away from the fort. Boone led a frantic, relentless pursuit and rescued her, but it was a terrifying echo of the past, a reminder that the war was never far away. The ultimate proof of that long shadow came 9 years after James's death, at the disastrous Battle of Blue Licks in 1782. By then, Boone was a seasoned commander, a living legend. But on that day, against his better judgment, he was goaded into a reckless charge against a combined force of British and native warriors. It was a slaughter, and in the chaos of the retreat, Boone's other son, Israel, who was fighting at his side, was shot from his horse. Daniel, under a hail of fire, tried to carry his son's body from the field, but it was too late. He had to leave another son behind on the dark and bloody ground. The cycle of violence that began on the banks of Wallens Creek had come full circle, claiming another of his children. The story of Boone in Kentucky is not one of triumph. It is a story of a man who won a country but lost a family, a man who lived the rest of his days under a shadow so long the sun could never truly reach him again. To most of America, the legacy that grew from that bloody creek bank is simple and clear. It's the story of Daniel Boone, the pathfinder, the brave frontiersman who faced down a savage wilderness to bring the light of civilization westward. In this telling, James Boone is a martyr, an innocent lamb sacrificed on the altar of manifest destiny. It's a clean, heroic narrative, the kind you carve into monuments and teach in schoolbooks. It's the story of a hero who persevered through unimaginable loss to found a state. But that's not the only story this land remembers. To this day, if you speak to descendants of the Shawnee, the people who were driven from their sacred hunting grounds, you will hear a very different legacy. In their story, Daniel Boone isn't a hero. He's the architect of an invasion. He wasn't a pioneer. He was the leader of a band of trespassers who ignored every warning to turn back. In this version of the story, the attack at Wallens Creek was not an act of random cruelty. It was a desperate, violent act of defense, a last-ditch effort to protect a way of life from being extinguished. And that's where the memory gets truly complicated, tangled up in the tale of the grieving warrior who may have led the attack. Was it an act of unprovoked savagery? Or was it a terrible symmetrical act of revenge, a wound for a wound? In one legacy, he is a nameless, faceless monster. In another, he is a father, driven to madness by his own loss, inflicting the very same pain that had been inflicted upon him. He becomes a dark mirror, of Daniel Boone himself. So which story is true? The hero or the invader? The martyr or the trespasser? The hard truth is, the answer depends entirely on which side of the Cumberland Gap your ancestors stood. The truth is a matter of perspective. One man's pioneer is another man's destroyer. One man's tragedy is another man's last stand. The war for Kentucky didn't end when the shooting stopped. It continues to this day, fought not with rifles and tomahawks, but with the stories we choose to tell and the ghosts we choose to honor. A story this brutal can't live forever as just a set of facts. The human mind can't hold on to that much sharp-edged horror. Over time, it has to be reshaped. The pain has to be dulled, the events smoothed over, until the history becomes something else entirely, a legend. And that's exactly what happened here. The true, documented story of James Boone's death became the seed for 100 years of local ghost stories and cautionary tales. Locals will tell you not to camp by Wallens Creek, especially not in October. They say that if you come down here at dusk, when the light is failing and the mist starts to rise off the water, you have to be quiet and listen. They say you might hear something on the wind that isn't the wind, a thin crying sound. Some say it's the ghost of a young boy, forever lost, forever calling out for a father who came too late. Fishermen have talked for generations about a cold spot near the bank, a patch of air that stays chilled even on the hottest summer day. It's the haint of Wallens Creek, a permanent scar of sorrow left on the landscape. Over the decades, the story also became a tool, a boogeyman with a real name used by parents to keep their children close. "Don't you wander off," a mother would warn, "or what happened to the Boone boy will happen to you." The names might have gotten jumbled, the details blurred, but the core lesson remained. The wilderness is not your friend. Danger is silent, and it is always watching. The story became a fence, built of fear, to keep the next generation safe from the same fate. This is the final stage of a story's life. This is where history dissolves. The real James Boone, the 16-year-old boy full of hope for the future, is gone. In his place is a mournful spirit, a whisper in the trees. The complex, grieving Shawnee warrior is gone, replaced by a faceless shadow that stalks the woods. This is what happens when history is too painful to remember clearly. It gets turned into a haunting so that the community can forget the facts, but never, ever forget the feeling of that terrible morning. And so, we're back where we started, on the banks of Wallens Creek. The water still moves over the stones, and the wind still whispers through the sycamores. But it doesn't sound peaceful to me anymore. After peeling back the layers of history, of memory, and of legend, I understand what the echoes are saying now. The peace you feel here is a lie. It's just the silence that comes after a scream has finally faded. This isn't just the place where a boy died. This is the place where the myth of the peaceful frontier died with him. It's the place where Daniel Boone the man was forged, a man who would be haunted by this ground for the rest of his days. It's a story of grief, a story of revenge, and a story that reminds us that the history of this land wasn't a clean, heroic adventure. It was a messy, brutal, human tragedy, filled with fathers who lost their sons on both sides of the conflict. The next time you drive through these mountains and see a quiet little creek by the side of the road, or pass a forgotten historical marker, remember this one. Remember that these places aren't empty. They are libraries, filled with stories that are more terrible and more true than any legend you've ever been told. You just have to be willing to stop and listen to the silence. The boy is gone. The father's grief has long since turned to dust. The warrior's vengeance is forgotten. But the dark and bloody ground remembers. And the story remains.